Okay, picture this. You're trekking through the Sunshine Coast hinterland, and bam, right in the middle of all those trees, these massive brick chimneys.
It's almost like they're refusing to be swallowed up by nature.
Seriously. It makes you wonder what their story is, you know? Our deep dive today uses a photo that honestly gave me goosebumps, and this article called, "In the 1880s, deep in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, an ambitious dream was born."
It is fascinating to see these man-made structures battling against nature like that. It makes you think, what on earth happened here?
Exactly. What's the story behind these lonely things? They're about 30 feet and 22 feet high, with 2 fireplaces each. The article says that means they were probably part of dividing walls in a bigger building.
And that photo you mentioned adds a whole other layer to it. You can kind of see where a house used to be, like a ghost image of a foundation. And get this, if you look closely, the shapes in the brickwork are actually floor joists. It's like the building's trying to tell us something.
It's definitely giving mystery vibes. Okay, so we've got these massive chimneys, clearly part of something bigger, but get this, they were actually part of a 22-room sanatorium that never got used.
Really?
Yeah, it burned down before it even opened.
Wow, it's like a dream that got cut short and makes you wonder what went wrong. Was it just the fire, or were there other issues too? Maybe money problems or delays in building it, or maybe even the way they treated patients was already changing at the time?
Such good questions. It feels like we're detectives trying to solve a puzzle from over a century ago.
Yeah.
But before we get carried away, let's back up and talk about the man behind this ambitious project, Dr. Richard Rendle.
Ah, yes, Dr. Rendle, quite the character. He arrived in Brisbane back in 1876. He was the surgeon superintendent on a ship called the Queen of Nations.
Surgeon superintendent. That's
Well, it basically meant he was in charge of everyone's health on board that long trip from England. It says a lot about his skills as a doctor and a leader, I think.
definitely impressive. No wonder he was confident enough to build a whole sanatorium. The article says he bought this 642-acre property just a few years after arriving in Brisbane in 1884. And get this, he was a big deal in society, even ran for office once.
Unsuccessfully, though, right?
Right, but still. And guess what his campaign was all about? Sanitation.
You're kidding. That's ironic considering his later ventures.
Right. Almost like he was hinting at his own goals for public health. He wasn't afraid of big ideas. But maybe that ambition, plus his connections to powerful people like Samuel Griffith, contributed to his downfall. He went bankrupt in 1894 and died in 1907.
It does make you wonder if this Tanawat project played a role in all that, doesn't it?
Like a real-life tragedy.
Yeah.
But let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the logistics of this whole thing. Building a 22-room sanatorium back in the 1880s, deep in the hinterland. I can't imagine it was easy.
Not at all. There were no cars or trucks back then, and the roads weren't reliable. Everything had to be shipped to the Moola River and then hauled to the site by bullock teams, according to the article.
Wow, that would take in some serious time and effort. Talk about dedication. And you know what's interesting? The fire bricks in those chimneys have a stamp on them that says Campbell.
Oh, that's a good clue. I wonder who Campbell was and where those bricks were made. It might seem small, but it could tell us so much about how they built the place, the trade routes back then, and even who was involved in making it all happen.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. Who knew a brick stamp could be so exciting? Makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden in plain sight. But for now, let's focus on the folks who rediscovered this site and put the pieces of the puzzle together, those local residents whose memories bring this whole story to life.
The article mentions a guy named George Burnett, who, as a kid, went to an auction where they sold off all the furniture and stuff from the sanatorium after the project failed. Imagine that, seeing the leftovers of this grand vision being sold off piece by piece. That's history coming alive.
Wow, that would have been incredible. A real glimpse into the past. And then there's Robert Sly. His dad actually bought the property in 1918, and he even talked to Dr. Rendle's daughter, though she didn't remember much about the sanatorium because she was just a kid when it was around.
Still, even those little snippets of memories are valuable. They offer a personal perspective that you wouldn't find in any history books. And it's because of stories like those and people like Nev Wilson, who made the chimney site a park back in 1992, that we can even have this conversation today.
It reminds us that history isn't just about big events and official records. It's about people's stories and memories too. So in this first part of our deep dive, we've covered a lot: those fascinating chimneys, the enigmatic Dr. Rendle, the tough task of building back then. But there's still so much more to uncover. What do you say we take a closer look at the whole world of sanatoriums and why Dr. Rendle had this vision in the first place?
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive deeper into the history and see what other secrets we can uncover. It's amazing how these chimneys still capture our imagination, even though they're all that's left of a failed dream.
Yeah, they really make you think about what could have been. Like, what would it have been like to be a patient there, you know? What was Dr. Rendle hoping to create?
Well, the article called it a sanatorium, not a hospital. There's a difference there, especially back in the late 1800s. Sanatoriums were for long-term care, mainly for people with chronic illnesses like tuberculosis.
So not just a quick visit for a broken leg or something.
No, not at all. People would stay for months, sometimes years, hoping to get better.
And why build it so far out in the hinterland? Seems a bit inconvenient, to say the least.
That was actually a big part of the treatment back then. The idea was to surround patients with nature, fresh air, sunlight, peace, and quiet. They believed it could help them heal.
Okay, so imagine it. You're a patient at Dr. Rendle's sanatorium in the 1880s, surrounded by lush bushland, fresh mountain air, maybe taking walks in the forest.
Sounds pretty idyllic, right?
Totally.
But the reality was probably a lot tougher. Treatments were limited back then, and the focus was on rest and isolation. So yes, the setting might have been peaceful, but you were also far from your family and everything familiar.
And tuberculosis was no joke back then. It was called consumption, and there was no real cure, no antibiotics or anything. So even with the nice setting, there must have been a lot of fear and uncertainty.
Absolutely. Tuberculosis was a devastating disease. People were terrified of it, and there was a lot of stigma around it. Dr. Rendle, with his focus on sanitation and public health, probably saw this sanatorium as a way to help, to isolate and treat the sick and protect everyone else.
It's incredible how these chimneys take us back to a time when people were desperate for answers and clinging to hope. It really makes you appreciate how far we've come in treating tuberculosis today.
It does, but it also reminds us that the fight against infectious diseases is far from over. Tuberculosis is still a problem in many parts of the world, and those old sanatoriums actually taught us valuable lessons about isolation, fresh air, and supportive care lessons that are still relevant today.
That's a good point. History isn't just about the past. It helps us understand the present and even the future. But let's get back to our mystery. We've talked about Dr. Rendle and the challenges of building back then, but we still don't know what caused that fire.
Well, the article mentioned that bushfires were common in the area, so it could have been a stray ember, a sudden change in wind direction. It wouldn't have taken much to start a fire in a wooden building, especially one that was still being built.
And it was up on a hill, surrounded by trees.
Yeah.
If a fire started there, it would have spread like crazy.
Exactly. And firefighting back then wasn't what it is today. They wouldn't have had the equipment or manpower to put out a big bushfire.
So it's totally possible that the fire was just a terrible accident, something Dr. Rendle couldn't have predicted or prevented.
That's a very likely scenario. But there's always that little voice, isn't there? Could there have been something more? Did someone do something to cause that fire?
Ooh, now we're talking. Are you suggesting foul play? Could someone have had a reason to sabotage Dr. Rendle's project?
I wouldn't rule it out. Dr. Rendle was ambitious, a prominent figure. He must have had rivals and people who didn't like him. And those powerful connections he had, like with Samuel Griffith, could have made some enemies too.
So someone who saw him as a threat or a competitor or just wanted to see him fail, they could have burned the place down.
It's possible, though we can't be sure based on what we know. But imagine the damage a fire like that could do, especially to a project that wasn't even finished. Ruined reputations, financial losses, accusations of negligence.
It's like a mystery novel, right? The ambitious doctor, the grand project, the suspicious fire, and those chimneys standing there watching it all unfold.
Exactly, and it's that element of the unknown that makes this story so intriguing. We can look at the facts, speculate, but ultimately we don't have all the answers.
It's a good reminder that history isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes it's messy and full of gaps that we can only try to fill with our imaginations. Okay, so we've explored some possible causes for the fire, but what about the site itself? Did it just become this forgotten piece of land with those chimneys as the only reminder of what could have been?
Well, it doesn't seem like it was totally forgotten. The article mentioned that Robert Sly's father bought the property in 1918. That means people were still interested in the land even after the fire.
Right, so it wasn't completely abandoned. People still knew about the sanatorium and its story, even if the details get a little fuzzy over time.
Exactly. And that's how local history often survives. It's passed down, maybe changes a bit along the way, but the main story stays alive.
And in this case, it's those chimneys that keep the story alive, making people ask questions and want to learn more.
They're a real physical connection to the past. They make us curious and help us imagine what could have been.
And thankfully, those chimneys will keep standing, thanks to people like Nev Wilson. They're a reminder of Dr. Rendle's ambition, the tragedy of the fire, and the importance of local history.
It shows us that history isn't just something we read in books, it's all around us, even in the most unexpected places.
Speaking of discoveries, there's one last piece of this puzzle that I think we should look at. It might help us understand the bigger picture, the world that Dr. Rendle was living in.
Oh, and what's that?
Well, I think it's time we take a trip back to the late 1800s. Let's explore the society, culture, and medical knowledge of that time, the things that shaped Dr. Rendle's vision and ultimately influenced what happened to the Tanawha Sanatorium.
I like it. Let's dive into that historical context and see what we can learn.
Okay, so we've checked out those mysterious chimneys, dug into Dr. Rendle's life, and even thought about, well, maybe someone burned the place down on purpose.
Right.
But to really get this story, we need to jump back in time to the late 1800s.
It's like we've been looking at all these separate pieces, and now we need to see how they all fit together in the big picture.
Exactly. So picture Australia in the 1880s. Tons of growth, new industries, society changing fast. But also a lot of uncertainty, especially when it came to, staying healthy.
True. Back then, they didn't really understand germs yet, so diseases like typhoid, cholera, and of course tuberculosis, they were everywhere.
It's scary to think about how afraid people must have been.
It must have been terrifying not knowing how to stop these illnesses.
And remember how Dr. Rendle ran for office talking about sanitation?
Right.
That just shows how worried everyone was about public health.
Definitely. Cleanliness and hygiene were like the main weapons they had.
So, building a sanatorium, especially somewhere like the Sunshine Coast hinterland, it must seem like a good idea.
Oh, absolutely. A way to keep those who were sick away from everyone else, give them a chance to recover.
And give everyone else some peace of mind.
Exactly. It was about managing the medical side of things, but also the social impact, the fear that people felt.
It's crazy to think that those chimneys just standing there in the bush connect us to all the anxieties, the uncertainty, the fear of getting sick that was everywhere back then.
It reminds us that history is about more than just dates and events. It's about how people lived and felt.
It makes the fire even more tragic, doesn't it? It wasn't just a building that burned, it was a dream that went up in smoke.
Yeah. It makes you wonder what would have happened if the sanatorium had been finished. Would it have actually helped people? Would Dr. Rendle have become famous for it?
We'll never know for sure, but it just goes to show that even something that seems isolated can have a huge impact.
Right. The Tanawha Sanatorium, even though it was never finished, was tied to all these bigger trends in society and medicine.
It's a reminder that every place has a story to tell.
And those stories are all connected to something bigger.
This whole deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with some mysterious chimneys, and look where we ended up. We talked about Dr. Rendle's ambitions, the challenges of living back then, the power of local history.
And how much disease has shaped our world.
It all started with a simple question, right? What's the story here?
Sometimes the smallest things can lead to the biggest discoveries.
It's all about being curious, wanting to know more, to peel back the layers of time and find the hidden stories that make up our world.
And who knows what other mysteries are out there, waiting to be uncovered, maybe right in your own neighborhood. An old building, a photograph, a family legend.
So keep your eyes open and your mind curious. Remember, history is all around us.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Tanawha chimneys. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those stories alive.